It all started with a man smiling on my front porch like he was about to do me a favor. And by the end of that fall, his company was tearing apart a brand new loading dock because they had tried to erase 70 years of my family's history with one crooked survey. Looking back now, people always ask if I knew I was going to win. Honestly, I didn't. There were nights when I sat alone in my kitchen staring at a stack of old papers, wondering if everything my grandfather had left me was about to disappear because someone in a corporate office decided an old wooden shed wasn't worth respecting. My name is Ethan Walker, and I live just outside the little town of Brookfield, Missouri, where folks still wave at each other from pickup trucks and everyone somehow knows whose dog wandered into whose pasture before lunchtime. My family has owned the same piece of land since my great-granddad came home from World War II. It isn't a huge farm, and it certainly isn't worth millions, but every fence post, every oak tree, every gravel path carries somebody's fingerprints. The little cedar shed sitting beside my north fence wasn't beautiful by most people's standards. The roof dipped in the middle, the paint had faded years ago, and one of the windows had been replaced with a piece of cloudy plexiglass after my cousin accidentally hit it with a baseball back in the 80s. But if you opened that old door, you could still smell cedar mixed with linseed oil and machine grease. The exact smell I remembered from being 8 years old while my grandfather sharpened mower blades and told stories about growing up when this entire area was nothing but fields. He built that shed in 1953 with lumber he cut himself, and before he passed away he made me promise one thing: take care of this place, son. Land remembers who loves it. At the time, I thought it was just something old men like to say. Years later, I finally understood what he meant. Everything stayed peaceful until a national grocery chain built a massive new supermarket across the highway. Folks around town were excited. New jobs, cheaper groceries, fresh pavement. Nobody complained. Neither did I. I even stopped in during their grand opening and bought a pie from the bakery. The manager shook my hand and thanked me for supporting the business. If you told me that same company would be threatening my property 6 weeks later, I'd have laughed in your face. Then one warm June morning, I heard tires crunching on my gravel driveway. I looked out the kitchen window and saw a silver pickup with the company logo on the door. A clean-cut guy wearing pressed khakis and a blue polo climbed out carrying one of those shiny presentation folders that always makes bad news look professional. He walked up with the confidence of somebody who had never once been told no. "Morning," he said, flashing a practiced smile. "Mr. Walker?" I nodded. "Can I help you?" He pointed past me toward the cedar shed. "Actually, we're here because you'll need to remove that structure." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "Corporate has determined it creates a visibility issue from the edge of our parking lot. We'd appreciate it if you could have it demolished within 30 days. For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. I even laughed. "Well, that's funny," I said, "because it's been sitting there for over 70 years. His smile didn't move an inch. "I'm afraid this isn't optional." That was when the knot first formed in my stomach. I stepped off the porch and looked toward the property line. The shed hadn't moved. The fence hadn't moved. The oak tree beside it was probably older than the state highway itself. Nothing looked different except the giant slab of fresh asphalt they had poured behind it. "You're on the wrong property," I told him. "That shed is entirely on my land." He opened the folder, pulled out a glossy site drawing covered in colored lines, and tapped one corner with his pen. "According to our survey, this portion falls within the commercial access easement." I stared at the paper, then back at him. "Your survey is wrong." He shrugged like he'd heard that 100 times before. "Then I suggest you prove it." He handed me an envelope, thanked me for my time as though we'd just finished discussing the weather, climbed back into his truck, and drove away, leaving dust floating through the morning air. I stood there for a long minute holding that envelope without opening it. My neighbor, Walt, happened to drive past pulling his fishing boat. He slowed down and yelled, "Everything all right?" I forced a grin and held up the envelope. Depends how much trouble fits inside one piece of paper. He laughed and kept driving. I wish I'd laughed too. Instead, I walked back inside, poured myself another cup of coffee that suddenly tasted bitter, opened the envelope, and felt my heart sink as the first sentence began with the words, "Formal notice of encroachment." The next few weeks felt like somebody had quietly replaced my normal life with a slow-motion train wreck. Every few days, another envelope showed up in my mailbox, thicker than the last, packed with legal language that somehow managed to sound threatening without ever raising its voice. They used words like obstruction, compliance, liability, and mandatory removal, as if repeating them enough times would magically turn their mistake into my responsibility. I kept telling myself there had to be some misunderstanding. Companies that big didn't just invent property lines, did they? Still, every time I walked past my grandfather's shed, I caught myself looking at it a little differently, almost wondering if maybe my memory had betrayed me. It's amazing what doubt can do when somebody with expensive lawyers plants it in your head. One afternoon, Walt wandered over carrying 2 cold beers and found me sitting on an overturned bucket beside the shed with a stack of yellow documents spread across an old workbench. "You look like a man trying to solve a murder," he joked. I laughed, but it came out flat. "Feels more like I'm trying to prove my own house exists." He picked up one of the old surveys and whistled. "Your granddad kept everything. He trusted paper more than promises," I said. "Guess I'm starting to understand why." That evening, I unlocked the old pantry safe where my grandfather kept every deed, tax receipt, survey, and handwritten note he collected over 50 years. The hinges squealed exactly the way they always had. Inside were folders wrapped in twine, faded maps folded so many times the corners were almost transparent, and receipts written on paper older than I was. I spent hours at the kitchen table, carefully unfolding every survey while a coffee grew cold beside me. Then I found it, a survey completed in 1979 after the county widened the highway. The boundary line was unmistakable. The shed sat comfortably inside our property with nearly 3 feet to spare. I smiled for the first time in days. "There you are," I whispered to nobody. But that feeling lasted less than 5 minutes because when I compared it to the grocery company's engineering drawing, something impossible jumped off the page. Their parking lot seemed to stretch farther west than the county survey allowed, not by inches, by almost 10 feet. At first I thought I was reading it wrong. I grabbed a ruler, measured both copies, checked the scale again and again until my eyes hurt. Every calculation ended in the same place. Either 70 years of county records were wrong, or somebody's brand new survey had quietly moved my property line. The next morning, I drove straight to the county courthouse. Rain tapped against the windshield most of the way there, and I kept rehearsing what I'd say if someone told me the company was right. The records office hadn't changed since I was a kid. Same faded linoleum, same humming fluorescent lights, same smell of old paper mixed with copier toner. Behind the counter sat Mrs. Evelyn Harper, who had probably helped 3 generations of Brookfield residents untangle property records. She looked over her glasses and smiled. "Ethan Walker. Haven't seen you since your father's probate. Wish this visit were happier." I laid every document across the counter. She adjusted her glasses, studied them quietly, then frowned. "Something doesn't line up." Hearing someone else say it made my pulse quicken. For the next 2 hours, she pulled out plat books, archived surveys, zoning amendments, easement records, and planning maps. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight while page after page covered the long wooden table. Finally, she stopped, leaned closer to one faded county map filed 5 years earlier, and pointed with the eraser of her pencil. "Right there." I almost missed it. A tiny handwritten notation barely visible beneath an official stamp. Someone had approved a revised commercial access easement during the grocery development process. 10 feet. 10 feet west, straight into my property. "Can they just do that?" I asked. Evelyn slowly shook her head. "Not without a recorded agreement from the affected landowner." She searched another file cabinet. Nothing. Another drawer. Still nothing. Then she looked at me with the kind of expression government employees usually avoid. "Ethan, I don't think you ever signed anything." I felt every muscle in my shoulders tighten because nobody ever asked me. Driving home that afternoon, anger finally replaced fear. Up until then, I'd been defending myself against what I thought might have been an honest mistake. Now it felt different. Somebody somewhere had approved paperwork that erased a piece of my family's property without ever knocking on my door. That night's sleep never really came. Every passing pair of headlights flashed across my bedroom ceiling, and every time I closed my eyes, I imagined bulldozers backing toward my grandfather's shed. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up, made coffee, and sat on the porch watching the sun crawl over the fields. My grandfather used to say, "Panic wastes daylight." So instead of panicking, I started making phone calls. My first call was to Daniel Brooks, a land use attorney about 40 miles away who had earned a reputation for taking cases nobody else wanted. I expected to leave a voicemail. Instead, he answered on the second ring. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from him in his office, while he silently examined every survey, deed, and zoning map. He barely spoke for almost half an hour. Then he leaned back, folded his arms, and smiled. "Well, if these documents are authentic, somebody has a very expensive problem." "Mine?" I asked. He chuckled. "No, theirs." He explained that if the company had built permanent structures across the true easement boundary using an improperly adjusted survey, the consequences could extend far beyond my shed. Their loading dock, part of their truck entrance, and several utility installations might actually sit outside the legal commercial easement. I stared at him. "You're saying this isn't about one old shed anymore?" "Not even close," he replied. "It's about whether a billion-dollar company built part of its operation where it never had permission to build." Before lunch, we had already filed for an emergency injunction preventing any action against my property until the boundary dispute could be resolved. Watching the county clerk slam that heavy filing stamp onto our paperwork felt strangely satisfying. It wasn't loud, but somehow it sounded like somebody finally saying enough. Daniel wasn't finished. "Big companies know how to fight lawsuits," he said as we walked outside. "What they hate is bad publicity." Those words stuck with me all afternoon. Back in Brookfield, I remembered that a local reporter named Rachel Monroe had covered the supermarket's grand opening a few months earlier. I found her number online, expected another voicemail, and instead heard an energetic voice answer immediately. "This is Rachel." I took a deep breath. "I think the grocery store that everybody celebrated might have built part of its parking lot on my family's land, and I think I can prove it." There was a long pause. Then she asked one simple question. "Can I come see the documents?" That single sentence changed everything, although I wouldn't realize it until the following morning, when 2 news cameras rolled up the same gravel driveway where the corporate representative had smiled at me just a few weeks earlier. The following morning, I heard another truck coming up the gravel driveway, but this time I didn't feel that knot in my stomach. It wasn't another corporate representative carrying threats dressed up as paperwork. It was Rachel Monroe with her cameraman and a producer balancing coffee cups while trying not to trip over my uneven driveway. Rachel shook my hand and smiled. "Show me everything. Start wherever you think the truth begins." So I did. I walked her through every inch of that property. Not because I thought an old shed was going to make great television, but because I wanted someone besides me to understand why it mattered. I showed her the cedar boards my grandfather had milled himself, the initials he carved into one corner when he finished the roof, the old vise still bolted to the workbench where he taught me how to sharpen an axe without ruining the edge. I even pulled out an old photograph from 1956 showing him standing beside the finished shed, with my father sitting on his shoulders, both of them grinning like they just built a cathedral instead of a 12 by 16 tool shed. Rachel didn't interrupt much. She just kept taking notes. At one point, she quietly said, "People are going to think this story is about a building." I smiled and shook my head. "Then they're missing the point." That evening, the story aired during the local 6 o'clock news. They showed drone footage of the supermarket sitting beside my property, then cut to the faded county survey, the revised easement, and finally, the old cedar shed standing exactly where it had always stood. I looked into the camera and said the simplest thing I could think of. If someone with enough money can quietly move your property line 10 feet today, what stops them from moving it 20 feet tomorrow? Apparently, a lot of people had been asking themselves similar questions, because by sunrise my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Old classmates I hadn't spoken to in years called to wish me luck. Farmers from neighboring counties sent emails saying they'd gone outside and checked their own fence lines after seeing the report. One retired surveyor even mailed me copies of state regulations with handwritten notes in the margins. Then, something happened that completely changed the balance of power. A former engineering subcontractor who had briefly worked on the grocery project contacted Daniel privately. He couldn't discuss confidential details, but he confirmed that concerns had been raised during construction about inconsistencies between older county records and updated development drawings. According to him, those concerns never made it past middle management because correcting the mistake would have delayed the grand opening and cost a fortune. Hearing that didn't make me feel victorious. It made me angry in a different way. Somewhere along the line, somebody had apparently looked at my family's land, weighed it against a construction deadline, and decided we were the cheaper problem. About a week after the news story aired, my phone rang again. This time, it was the company's regional vice president. His tone couldn't have been more different from the man who'd first walked onto my porch. Gone was the polished confidence. In its place was careful corporate diplomacy. "Mr. Walker, we'd like to discuss a confidential settlement that would fully compensate you for any inconvenience." I leaned back in my chair and looked through the kitchen window toward the shed. Out of curiosity, I asked, "What changed?" He hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking. Finally, he replied, "We believe it's in everyone's best interest to resolve this efficiently." I almost laughed. A month earlier, efficiency meant tearing down my grandfather's shed. Now efficiency meant hoping I would quietly sign paperwork and make the story disappear. "No," I said calmly. "We're going to let the county finish what it started." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds before he thanked me for my time and ended the call. Daniel smiled when I told him. "That," he said, "is the sound of lawyers realizing this isn't getting any smaller." The town council meeting turned into something nobody expected. The parking lot filled an hour before it started. People stood along the walls because every chair inside was taken. Reporters from neighboring counties showed up. Even the mayor admitted afterward he'd never seen that many residents attend a zoning hearing. One by one, the evidence came out. The original deeds, the 1979 survey, the county plats, the revised easement. Every document told the same story except one. Then the company's surveyor took the stand. I'll give him credit for one thing. Once he realized the records couldn't support the revised boundary, he stopped trying to defend the indefensible. Under questioning, he admitted the revised easement had been created using an incorrect reference point transferred from a preliminary development drawing instead of the officially recorded monument locations. It sounded technical, but the meaning was painfully simple. Somebody measured from the wrong place. Nobody caught it. Construction continued anyway, and my family's property became collateral damage. You could actually hear people whispering behind me. One council member removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another flipped back through the exhibits for nearly a minute before quietly asking, "So, if Mr. Powdak Walker hadn't challenged this, would anyone have discovered the mistake?" The surveyor looked down before answering. "Probably not." That sentence hung in the room like heavy smoke. A few minutes later, the council voted unanimously. The revised easement was declared invalid, the original property boundary restored, and the grocery company was ordered to remove every permanent structure extending beyond the lawful line, including the loading dock that hundreds of delivery trucks had already been using. Nobody clapped. Nobody celebrated. The decision felt bigger than that. It felt like everyone in the room understood they had just watched a very expensive lesson unfold. Demolition started about 3 weeks later. Every morning I could hear jackhammers echoing across the highway while concrete broke apart piece by piece. Ironically, the sound that had once filled me with dread became strangely comforting. I wasn't enjoying their loss. I was watching accountability happen in real time. One afternoon, the original representative who had delivered that first notice unexpectedly walked across the road toward my fence. For a second, I thought another argument was coming. Instead, he stopped beside the shed, looked at it for several seconds, then quietly said, I owe you an apology. I didn't answer immediately. He continued. I should have asked questions instead of assuming the paperwork was right. I nodded. Most people trust paper. He gave a tired smile. After this, I probably never will again. We shook hands. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness either. It was simply two people acknowledging that arrogance had finally run out of places to hide. By October, the company had finished removing the loading dock and restoring the edge of my property. Then they did something nobody expected. Working with the local historical society, they repaired the cedar shed at their own expense, matched the original paint color, reinforced the roof without changing its appearance, and installed a bronze plaque that read, Walker Heritage Shed, built 1953, preserved as a reminder of Brookfield's agricultural history. The first time I saw families stopping to read that plaque, I couldn't help smiling. Not because we'd won, not because the company lost, but because my grandfather's little shed, which someone once dismissed as an obstacle, had become the one thing everyone noticed. Sometimes I still sit on the old bench beside it in the evenings as the sun drops behind the supermarket. The parking lot lights come on. Shoppers push carts toward their cars. Kids laugh. People hurry home for dinner. And that little cedar building just keeps standing there exactly where it has for more than 70 years, quietly reminding anyone willing to listen that history has a stubborn way of surviving convenience. My grandfather told me years ago that land remembers who loves it. Back then, I thought it was just an old farmer's way of sounding wise. Today, I know he was talking about something much bigger than dirt and fence posts. He was talking about character, about refusing to let truth be negotiated away simply because the other side has deeper pockets. Now I'm curious what you think. If a huge corporation offered you a confidential settlement after trying to take part of your family's land, would you have signed the agreement and moved on? Or would you have insisted on fighting all the way through a public hearing so everyone could see what happened? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one. And stories like this remind us that justice isn't always about who has the most money. Sometimes it's about who refuses to step aside when everyone expects them to.